everyone. Once again, hello everyone. Once again, here in the Tuesday session with Gabriel and the other ones around the world. We are going to have today a double back, possibly in this session, the session 23 and 24, or 24 and 25. Oh my God. The Gabriel is the one who is going actually to talk about the sessions. And so we are really thankful that you are enjoying this time with us and you are able even to see this. If you have questions, again, the space is open for it. So I will welcome our host, Gabriel, our back host, Daniel, and all the other ones who are here in this part of the universe virtual place. So welcome, welcome everyone, and welcome, Gabriel.
Gracias. Yes, we're going to cover for the first time two sessions in one session, one of our sessions. So 24, session 24 is primarily talking about history and wrapping up the the last parts of this major cycle. If you have been following the tendency here of Don's questions to kind of finish the first book. I don't know if this was planned, but to finish the first line of questioning in terms of the great cycle was to go through each major cycle. And now we are at the end. So we're going to get some history in terms of, um, I would say, recorded history, sort of getting in that era. So there is not much, if anything, that might come up from my part here, but we're going to read it, especially because in this session, there's another thing that Carla was sick, so she had a cough. And some of the questions or numbered questions are just coughing. So we're going to skip through them. That's why you'll see that I'll mention, question four and then go to probably question six and so on. And in fact, we're going to start with question four because at the beginning, there's just a little bit of conversation about her being sick and that Don requested that Ra would make Carla's body cough. So let's start because it's two sessions. And question number four is where they start the dialogue. Don says, the way I intend to continue with the book is to follow on through the last 25,000 years cycle that we are in now and possibly investigate a little of fourth density conditions and thereby find many places that we go back and delve further into the law of one. The first material I expect to be not too deep with respect to the law of one. I hope to get into greater philosophical areas of the law of one in more advanced sessions so as to make the material progress so that it will be understandable. I hope that I'm following this or the right direction in this. And we can see here Don's mind, like how did it want to explore this history and moving all the way to fourth density, which is what we're getting into. So he wanted to go linearly through time to understand better through his mind the law of one. And a good reminder here that this was all for them. This was not for us, let's say. It so happens that it's helpful to everybody else who is interested in this. But this was all for Don, Carla, and Jim. They were just kind enough to make it available to us. So Don continues and says, in the last session, you mentioned that during the last 25,000 year cycle, the Atlanteans, Egyptians, and those in South America were contacted, and then the Confederation departed. I understand the Confederation did not come back for some time. Could you tell me of the reasons and consequences and attitudes with respect to the next contact with those here on planet Earth? So after they left, what was the next contact? Of all of them, it seems. Ross says, in the case of the Atlanteans, enlargements upon the information given resulted in those activities distorted towards bellicosity, which resulted in the final second Atlantean catastrophe, 10,821 years in the past. It's pretty precise. We rarely get this precision from Ra. So 10,821 years in the past. Many, many were displaced due to societal actions both upon Atlantis and upon those areas of what you call North African deserts, to which some Atlanteans had gone after the first conflict. Earth changes continued due to these, what you would call nuclear bombs and other crystal weapons, sinking the last great land masses approximately 9,600 of your years ago. I think this was, according to the timeline, the last sinking of Atlantis. In the Egyptian and South American experiments, results, though not as widely devastating, were as far from the original intention of the Confederation. It was clear to not only us, but also to the Council and the Guardians that our methods were not appropriate for this particular sphere, you would think. Our attitude, thus, was one of caution, observation, and continuing attempts to creatively discover methods whereby contact from our entities could be of service with the least distortion and, above all, with the least possibility of becoming perversions or antithesis of our intentions in sharing information. Forgive my crude humor, but in Spanish, we say, no le damos hojilla a mono. You ever heard that, Tat? We don't give razor blades to monkeys, right? So technology and all that, oh, they might use this in a positive way, but no. So that's sort of what happens here. Question 6. Don says, thank you. Then I assume the Confederation stayed away from Earth for a period of time. What condition created the next contact the Confederation made? Ra says, in approximately 3,600 of your years in the past, as you measure time, there was an influx of those of the Orion group, as you call them, due to the increasing negative influences upon thinking and acting distortions. They were able to begin working with those whose impression from olden times, as you may say, was that they were special and different. An entity of the Confederation many, many thousands of your years in the past, the one you may call Yahweh, had by genetic cloning set up these particular biases among these peoples who had come gradually to dwell in the vicinity of Egypt, as well as in many, many other places, by dispersion after the down sinking of the land mass Mu. Here, the Orion group found fertile soil in which to plant the seeds of negativity. These seeds, as always, being those of the elite, the different, those who manipulate or enslave others. The one known as Yahweh felt a great responsibility to these entities. However, the Orion group had been able to impress upon the peoples the name Yahweh as the one responsible for this elitism. Yahweh then was able to make or take what you would call stock of its vibratory patterns and became, in effect, a more eloquently effective sound vibration complex. In this complex the old Yahweh, now unnamed, but meaning he comes, began to send positively oriented philosophy. This was approximately in your past of two, and they correct their numbers, 3,300 years. Thus, the intense portion of what has become known as Armageddon was joined. So, my careful and superficial comment here is just an observation that what was known as Yahweh was positive, and then it became sort of hijacked because of old impressions in the mind and negativity to kind of attribute to Yahweh this type of behaviors. And there was a correction of the original positive social memory complex that was known as Yahweh to now be a little bit more of help in terms of telepathy, I would say, the way I understand it. Other things can be explored, but not by me. Question 8, Don says, thank you. I have a question about how the Orion group got in 3,600 years ago. How did they get through the quarantine? Was that a random window effect? Ra says, at that time, this was not entirely so, as there was a proper calling for this information. When there is a mixed calling, the window effect is much more put into motion by the ways of the densities. The quarantine is, or the quarantine in this case was, shall we say, not patrolled so closely. Due to the lack of strong polarity, the windows thus needing to be very weak in order for penetration. As your harvest approaches, those forces of what you would call light work according to their call. The ones of Orion have the working only according to their call. This calling is in actuality not nearly as great. Thus, due to the way of empowering or squares, there is much resistance to penetration. Yet free will must be maintained, and those desiring negatively oriented information, as you would call it, must then be satisfied by those moving through by the window effects. So we see more balance here than more than anything, which to me, it makes sense that there is the higher the complexity of the societal complex, the more there's going to be opportunities. And the more opportunities, then the more the need for balance and the more interaction and intervention, we could say. And that's a way to sort of just barely touch on this topic that seems metaphysically very complex, to be honest. But balance is basically what we're seeing here, and balance in regards to complexity over time. Question 9, Don says, then Yahweh, in an attempt to correct what he saw as what I might call a mistake, I know that you don't like calling it that, started 3,300 years ago with the positive philosophy, where were both the Orion and Yahweh philosophies impressed telepathically, or were there other techniques used? Ra says there were two other techniques used. One by the entity no longer called Yahweh, who still felt that if it could raise up entities which were superior to the negative forces, that these superior entities could spread the law of one. Thus, this entity, Yo He Shin Vawe, came among your people in form according to incarnate being and mated in the normal reproductive manner of your physical complexes, thus birthing a generation of much larger beings, these beings called Anak. The other method used to greater effect later in the scenario, as you would call it, was the thought form, such as we often use among your peoples to suggest the mysterious or the sublime. You may be familiar with some of these appearances. So in the first case, they were using physical changes, and the second, suggestions, as we know, which are of paranormal, maybe UFO, that type of thing that suggests more of the mysterious. The other one was an attempt to balance physically, capacity, intelligence, and all that, which again, it's a tool, but what kind of mind uses that tool? Is it positive? Is it negative? Question 10, there's some coughing. Don says, could you state some of those after making the instrument cough, please? Ross says, this is information which you may discover. However, we will briefly point the way by indicating the so-called wheel within a wheel and the cherubim with sleepless eye. I forget. It's a very popular vision. I know some of you have. It's I forget the painting. I had it somewhere. Somebody knows what Rod's talking about here. You can put it in the chat. It's um it's a mystical vision that somebody had and it's been recorded for a long time. That's what Ra's talking about here. Question 11, Don says, very good that the Orion group used similar methods for their impression 3,600 years ago. Ra says the group or empire had an emissary in your skies at that time. Can you describe that emissary? This emissary was of the fiery nature, which was hidden by the nature of cloud in the day. This was to obliterate the questions of those seeing such a vehicle and to make it consonant with the entity's concept of what you may call the creator. Question 13. Don says, and then how was the impression or information passed on to the entities after they saw this fiery cloud? Ra says, by thought transfer and by the causing of fiery phenomena and other events to appear as being miraculous, through the use of thought forms. Next question. Don says, then were there any prophets that we have now recorded that sprung from this era or soon after it? And Ra says, those of the empire were not successful in maintaining their presence for long after the approximate 3,000-year date in your history and were, perforce, left with the decision to physically leave the skies. The so-called prophets were often given mixed information, but the worst that the Orion group could do was to cause the prophets or these prophets to speak of doom, as prophecy in those days was the occupation of those who loved their fellow beings and wish only to be of service to them and to the Creator. This is something that is still sort of common, I feel, and Carla and Jim at least used to talk about this, saying that you get mixed information depending on the tuning of your mind, and that information, it's a little dashed sometimes with some feelings of doom. This happens in your mind as well, so it's not that uncommon actually. It's just that when it's channel material, when it's given, for some reason, we seem to give too much importance to information. And when information is given too much power, it can be mixed, right? And I think that's one foundational lesson is not to give too much importance to information. But somehow modern society is just fascinated. It's fascinated and has a penchant for giving more importance to information rather than, that which is real. Information is not real. Information is just an abstract uh, extrapolation of truth. But that's what we have. And so in information, there's always going to be mixed, just like it is in the raw material and any other material, actually. Question 16, Don says, could you tell me if you're saying the Orion Group was successful in polluting, shall we say, some of the positively oriented prophets with messages of doom? Ron says, this is correct. Your next query shall be the last full query for this session. Don says, could you tell me why the Orion Group had to leave after, I believe, it figures to be 600-year period. So from 3,600 years ago to 3,000 years ago. Why did they have to leave? Ra says, although the impression that they had given to those who called them was that these entities were an elite group, that which you know as diaspora occurred, causing much dispersion of these peoples, so that they became an humbler and more honorable breed, less bellicose, and more aware of the loving kindness of the one Creator. The creation about them tended towards being somewhat bellicose, somewhat oriented towards the enslavement of others. But they themselves, the target of the Orion group, by means of their genetic superiority, weakness, became what you may call the underdogs, thereby letting the feelings of gratitude for their neighbors, their family, and their one creator begin to heal the feelings of elitism, which led to the distortions of power over others, which had caused their own bellicosity. So, again, I think the theme here is balance. And actually, in the next session, we're going to go deeper into balance. But um, the the effect that this intervention had was spread out. Um, there was some, of course, as always, use of the negative and then some use of the positive. I think the best way to summarize this is that we always get tools. The more advanced we are in terms of using our environment and ourselves, then the more opportunities that arise for us to use them in both ways. So, far from going to the specifics of what this meant, it's the same principle, let's say, that governs this availability of tools and, once again, information. And we're going to cover a couple more questions. Why not? So, question 19, Don says, it's not too important, but I would really be interested to know if Dwight Eisenhower met with either the Confederation or the Orion Group during the 1950s or that time. Ross says, the one of which you speak met with thought forms which are indistinguishable from third density. This was a test. We, the Confederation, wish to see what would occur if this extremely positively oriented and simple, congenial person with no significant distortions towards power happened across peaceful information and the possibilities which might append therefrom. We discovered that this entity did not feel that those under his care could deal with the concepts of other beings and other philosophies. Thus, an agreement reached then allowed him then an agreement reached then allowed him to go his way, ourselves to do likewise. In a very quiet campaign, as we have heard you call it, be continuing or continued alerting your peoples to our presence gradually. Events have overtaken this plan. Um, so in essence, according to this, Eisenhower believed that, or it was his judgment that people were not ready for this, and the way I understand it. And so they both went their own ways, and things happen as we know they happen, which is the continual witnessing and observing of this phenomena in our 3D perspective. And I think I'm just going to skip the rest. If anybody's interested, as always, let me know. I stop at question 19. We can move to session 25 now. We're going to start with the first question. And here, Don is asking about Carla. And I don't know if it was actually Carla that had the questions, and it was about being sick. So Don says, asking first what cause or complex of causes has led to the instrument's chest cold, as it is called. Remember that she was sick. So this is material from book 5 for those who are a little nuanced in knowing the origin of the questions, but the raw contact contains everything. Ross says this distortion towards illness was caused by the free will of the instrument in accepting a chemical substance which you called LSD. This was carefully planned by those entities which do not desire this instrument to remain viable. The substance has within it the facility of removing large stores of vital energy from the ingester. The first hope of the Orion entity, which arranged this opportunity, was that this instrument would become less polarized towards what you call the positive. Due to conscious efforts upon the part of this instrument, using the substance as a programmer for service to others and for thankfulness, this instrument was spared this distortion and there was no result satisfactory to the Orion group. This actually helps for what we're going to continue to explore in this session, which is intention, choosing, and the dynamics of offering. Keep those in mind. It's going to get intense from now on. The second hope lay in the possible misuse of the most powerful means of transmission of energy between your peoples in the area of body complex distortions. We have not previously spoken of the various types of energy blockages and transfers, positive and negative, that may take place due to participation in your sexual reproductive complex of actions. And this is something they're going to cover, I believe, in the next session, which, speaking of versions, is not in session 26 of the original books, but actually, I think in another session, 33 or 32. They moved it, they edited one of the biggest edits that they made. But we don't need to concern with that. It's going to be in the next session. This entity, however, is a very strong entity with very little distortion from universal green ray love energy. Thus, this particular plan was not affected either, as the entity continued to give of itself in this context in an open or green ray manner, rather than attempting to receive or to manipulate other self. Possibly Ra meant deceive and not receive, is a footnote there. So once again, we just see Carla's intention on being of love, of seeking service. Whatever it was offered, it was balanced out and actually improved. And this will make more sense as I go through the dialogue. The only remaining distortion available, says Ra, since this entity would not detune and would not cease sharing love universally under this chemical substance, was simply to drain this entity of as much energy as possible. This entity has a strong distortion towards busyness, which it has been attempting to overcome for some time, realizing it not to be the appropriate attitude for this work. In this particular area, the ingestion of this substance did indeed, shall we say, cause distortions away from viability due to the busyness and the lack of desire to rest. This instrument staying alert for much longer than appropriate. Thus, much vital energy was lost, making this instrument unusually susceptible to infections, such as it now experiences. So, consumption of psychedelics, LSD, opens the mind complex to higher experiences. These higher experiences are presented to the conscious mind. The conscious mind picks and chooses, of course. We see in Carla there was a constant seeking of sharing love, of service, and positive, let's say. So everything that was offered negative was kind of not rejected, but not considered as the option. And the last thing that the, let's say, a negative current of energy can provide is the weakness of Carla, which was always her body. And so the path of least resistance for this negative energy to go through was for her to just exacerbate or intensify her activity, which drained her. And draining your physical energy makes you more susceptible to infections, which is how she got sick. I hope that made sense. Any questions? Always ask them, please. In my head, it makes sense. So I'm hoping it makes sense in yours too. Question 2, Don says, the second question the instrument requested was, how may I best revitalize myself, not only now, but in the future? Ross says, this instrument is aware of the basic needs of its constitution, those being meditation, acceptance of limitations, experiences of joy through association with others and with the beauty as of the singing, and the exercising with great contact whenever possible with the life forces of second density, especially those of trees. This entity also needing to be aware of the moderate but steady intake of foodstuffs, exercise being suggested at a fairly early portion of the day and at a later portion of the day before the resting. This was to be the weakest point in Carla's time during the contact, which was that of retaining her body weight. She lost so much weight, and that is lack of nourishment and excess of activity, as we see here. And this was early, not even a month or a month precisely after the contact started. So over the years, she would shrink to a very low weight, and um, it's basically where the contact got the best or the worst out of her. Every other thing, I guess, it was well balanced, but somehow the ingestion of food and activity was just a problem. Don says the third question that she requested to be asked was, how may Don and Jim help to revitalize me? And Ra surprisingly says, this is not an appropriate question for a full answer. We can say only that these entities are most conscientious. We may add that due to this instrument's distortion towards imbalance in the space-time nexus, it would be well were this entity accompanied during exercise. So, meaning it would be a good idea if they go with her when, or be with her when she's exercising. Question 4, and here's where it gets really interesting. Don says, thank you. We shall now continue with the material from yesterday. You stated that about 3,000 years ago, the Orion Group left due to diaspora. Was the Confederation then able to make any progress after the Orion Group left? Ra says, for many of your centuries, both the Confederation and the Orion Confederation busied themselves with each other upon planes above your own, shall we say, planes in the time space, whereby machinations, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, were conceived and the armor of light girded on. Battles have been and are continuing to be fought upon these levels. We'll talk about that. Upon the Earth plane, energies had been set in motion, which did not cause a great deal of call. There were isolated instances of callings, one such taking place beginning approximately 2600 of your years in the past in what you would call Greece at this time, and resulting in writings and understandings of some facets of the law of one. We especially note the one known as Thales and the one known as Heraclitus, those being of the philosopher career, as you may call it, teaching their students. We also point out the understandings of the one known as Pericles. At this time, there was a limited amount of visionary information which the Confederation was allowed to telepathically impress. However, for the most part, during this time, empires died and rose according to the attitudes and energies set in motion long ago, not resulting in strong polarization, but rather in that mixture of the positive and the warlike, or negative, which has been characteristic of this final minor cycle of your beingness. Not to confuse more with cycles. When they say minor cycle, I am pretty sure they're referring to the last major cycle, which is the last 25,000 years. So something interesting here that I can't help but notice. Let's talk philosophy. Thales of Miletus was, to my understanding, the first Western philosopher that, in essence, said, wait a minute, what if? And that what if trickled down into many thinkers, particularly, I would say, Parmenides, Heraclitus, as they mentioned here, was just after Thales, just I don't know how many decades later. And Heraclitus, to me, is probably the most non-dual philosopher in Greece. So it's amazing that they mention him here. And Thales being the one. So Thales being the first one, linearly thinking, right? And then there is Heraclitus. Then it kind of takes its own shape through Socrates, which, by the way, was around the time of Pericles. And Pericles was just considered to be at the time uh, just gifted by the golden age of Greece, or in general. So many things happen. All this to say that what I find interesting is that Greece started to develop this new philosophy, this new approach of life around the same time that we get two of the most influential things to me in Eastern philosophy, which is Buddhism. Gautama Siddhartha was around the same time of Thales and Heraclitus. And around the same time, we have Lao Tzu. So we have Greek philosophy, we have Chinese non-dual philosophy, and Buddhism around the same time. I don't know, just one of those things. And yes, we can see the impact of all of this philosophically around the world. Something to chew on. Question 5. Don says, you spoke of an Orion Confederation and a battle fought between the Confederation and the Orion Confederation. Is it possible to convey any concept of how this battle is fought? This is going to get really, really amazing. So, wondering if I should read this first. Yes, I actually would love if anybody can write. What do you think when you hear the concept of battle being fought between the Confederation and the Orion Confederation? What's the first picture that comes to mind? How do you conceive it? What's happening? Um, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to read what Ross says, and then I want to give my impressions here. Ross says, picture, if you will, your mind. Very important to me. Picture your mind. Picture it then in total unity with all other minds of your society. You are then single-minded. And that which is a weak electrical charge in your physical illusion is now an enormously powerful machine whereby thoughts may be projected as things. In this endeavor, the Orion group charges or attacks the Confederation arms with light. The result, a standoff, as you would call it. Both energies being somewhat depleted by this and needing to regroup. The negative depleted through failure to manipulate, the positive depleted through failure to accept that which is given. I'm going to read the next one and then I'll expand my view here. Don says, could you amplify the meaning of what you said by failure to accept that which is given? So this exchange between Orion and the Confederation is a failure. There's a failure in this exchange. Ross says, at the level of time-space at which this takes place in the form of what you may call thought war, the most accepting and loving energy would be to so love those who wish to manipulate that those entities were surrounded, engulfed, and transformed by positive energies. This, however, being a battle of equals, the Confederation is aware that it cannot, on equal footing, allow itself to be manipulated in order to remain purely positive. For then, though pure, it would not be of any consequence, having been placed by the so-called powers of darkness under the heel, as you may say. It is thus that those who deal with this thought war must be defensive rather than accepting in order to preserve their usefulness in service to others. Thusly, they cannot accept fully what the Orion Confederation wishes to give, that being enslavement. Thusly, some polarity is lost due to this friction, and both sides, if you will, must then regroup. It has not been fruitful for either side. The only consequence, which has been helpful, is a balancing of the energies available to this planet so that these energies have less necessity to be balanced in this space-time, thus lessening the chances of planetary annihilation. So, I don't know about you, but my initial picture of this so-called battle is, entities battling each other as a reflection of what we see here as humans. We kind of created an allegory of what this encounter is. But I don't see it as a battle. I see it as a dynamic of opposites. And that is, to me, a little bit more, it's closer to the truth, at least to the truth that is reflected within all of our minds. To picture this in a different way, I would suggest that you see that there is unequivocal, what I'm going to say here, that there is awareness. Everybody can say, I am aware, right? And then there is experience, because you're always aware of experience, unless you are aware of awareness itself, and then there is no experience. There's just infinite being. Here's the thing. Identity will determine your state of being. If you identify with the experience, then your state of being will be with that experience, whatever that is. And experience is always polarized. Yes. So if you identify with the experience, you must be polarized. Keep that in mind. And this is what you experience right now as a limited being. You feel yourself to be a separate self, an individual. Now, when you are invested in experience, something happens. And that is, there is an offering of more experience that feeds your particular polarity, let's say. Yes. And the more you experience your polarity, must be balanced by something else. You cannot grow your polarity unless you're balanced by the other one. And this is the balance that we see. I'm not speaking of anything too advanced or complex here. Look at your mind. Your mind is always having a sort of conflict of thoughts. And it's our choosing of how we decide to act upon these thoughts that creates a higher polarity or a higher state of being. So if you want an example of this, to see an extreme example, look at a rock contact. One of the things that happened is that they were visited or they were greeted by a negative entity from fifth density. Why? Because the experience that they were given or offered was of sixth density. So an equal must be also available. And that equal opposite will create the same impact, possibly, on the experience that we call Don, Carl, and Jim. Yes? So all of us are always presented. Our mind, if you really pay attention to your mind, you're always going to see this balancing or offering, let's say. We are the ones who balance this. Now, you know the sinkhole of indifference. The sinkhole of indifference is not processing experience, not picking, not choosing, remaining stagnant. Okay. The opposite, or let's say how we move out of this, is by processing experience. And that is what we could call evolution. Um, Experience evolves or ascends as you pick your polarity. But you can only enhance your polarity by becoming aware of the other one. Yes? And every energy that is balanced, every polarity that is balanced with its opposite force is it's making our own polarity increase. That's the energy exchange. You must be exposed to the other side. And like I said, look at your mind and you're always going to see this. Every single thought has an opposite, and you're always choosing between those thoughts. Some of them just repeat and recycle. That's what we call catalysts, repeating. And as we process, as we pick, as we continue to grow and move in this direction, this is what we call polarization. And the same thing is happening at fourth density. And you'll see why as we keep reading, because it's an experience, right? But this is more like electrodynamics, if you want to see it that way. There is a positive charge, there is a negative charge. They both interact. There is some friction because of magnetic fields of each, and so they repel each other, but they remain at the same time together, and they can really mix. And that's what's happening here. On a ethical level, what's happening is that the negative, right, on a behavioral level, the negative is trying to say, hey, let's manipulate you. And the positive say, no, no, let's not do that. Let's just, be loving. And neither can accept each other. So there is a resistance, and then there is loss of polarity because of this intent of mixture. They can't. And so some learning happens. Now, you can see how the learning happens because, and this is the way I would describe it, if I want to manipulate you and you don't let me manipulate you because you want to be loving with me, now I've learned better ways to manipulate you, but you have learned better ways to give me more love. And so we just keep going over and over again. We both polarize, if we choose, to higher and higher levels of manipulation and love. And so we ascend. You see, the same thing is happening in your mind, in all of our minds. It's the same interaction. Because guess what? You have all the experiences in these energy centers that we have. So that is how I see this. I don't see this as a battle because there is no such thing as a battle. There are opposites interacting, and that interaction is all for the purpose of experience. All for the purpose of experience. Experience is what evolves. And who is it that experiences this moment? You. What do you mean by you? You mean a polarity? No, you're not one polarity. You're both, or neither, depending on how you want to identify that which is beyond duality, which is you. So my suggestion is that if you want to live the drama, identify with a polarity. If you want to experience the exchange and the truth, then don't identify with neither. This is the purification of the mind. Purification of the mind at a cosmic level or an individual level, it's always the same. It's an understanding of the truth of dynamics and not thinking that one is better than the other. That's just of a separate being. And it's fine. We have that privilege. That's our prerogative to identify. But get ready for the drama. Remember, experience is the result of all of this. And what do we call experience? Self-knowledge. The creator knows itself. So everything that you're experiencing in these exchange of energies, in this interaction of polarities, is just for self-knowledge. We do say, obviously, that what we call the positive path is the path of truth, because it's the path of unity. And that is true. That will be your guiding star, always. So remember, you are inside your own mind. You, I'm not talking to you, the individual. You, awareness, are inside your own mind. So everything that you see will be an interaction of opposites. So with that, we're going to see more of what this means in terms of the Confederation, positive, and Orion as negative. Question 7, Don says, very important point, I believe. Does a portion of the Confederation then engage in this thought battle? What percentage engages? Ross says, this is the most difficult work of the Confederation. Only 4 planetary entities at any one time are asked to partake in this conflict. Don says, what density are these 4 planetary entities? Ross says, these entities are of the density of love, numbering 4, meaning the density, 4th density. Don says, then I'm assuming this is the most effective density for this work. Would this density, an entity of this density, be more effective for this type of work than, say, an entity of density 5 or 6? And Ron says the 4th density is the only density besides your own which, lacking the wisdom to refrain from battle, sees the necessity of the battle. Thus, it is necessary that fourth density social memory complexes be used. So, you see, there's a lack of wisdom or understanding at this level of experience, which I'm not going to say it's out of the fourth density. Your fourth density is right here. Don't look any further. Don't try to put it outside. And there is a lack of wisdom, which creates this desire for wanting to help, which is something that we were talking about at the beginning off the record, wanting to help others. Um, there it is. That desire to help is for you to develop, and higher wisdom can shine through. Question 10, Don says, am I correct in assuming then that fourth density on both sides of both the Orion and the Confederation sides are in this battle, and that densities fifth and sixth of the Orion side do not engage in this? Is this correct? And Ra says this will be the last full question at this as this entity's energy are low. Remember, Carla was sick. And Ross says it is partially correct. Fifth and sixth density entities positive would not take part in this battle. Fifth density negative would not take part in this battle. Thus, the fourth density of both orientations join in this conflict. You can see here that Ross says fifth and sixth density entities positive, but they don't say sixth density negative. That's something um, for the structure of how things work. Sixth density is at some point, I think it continues to be negative at the lower levels, but then as it moves in the progression, it loses its polarity. Everything loses its polarity at sixth density. Last question. Uh, Don asks, as usual, well, I will first ask the answer at the end if there's anything we can do to make the instrument really comfortable. I'll only ask the questions that the instrument has, or answer the questions that the instrument has energy left to give. But I really would like to know of the orientation of fifth density negative for not participating in this battle. Ross says the fifth density is the density of light or wisdom. The so-called negative service to self entity in this density is at an high level of awareness and wisdom and has ceased activity except by thought. The fifth density negative is extraordinarily compacted and separated from all else. So it doesn't take part, and I don't think it needs to take part in this so-called battle. Perhaps at that point, manipulation is of those of fourth density, so they continue to do what seems more appropriate. I'm not sure how that works. I'm lost there. But that's it. That's all we got for session 24 and 25. Good timing, too.
Yes, like on time, like today we were having these numbers like 7 past 7, now like 20, and I was doing something else and I was like 666. Okay, synchronicity is just speaking there the whole time. I think this is since we have this double back today, you are able to double question everything. Um, like something I was wondering, and while you were just giving your point of view of what can be duality and what actually which kind of game you are playing here. Do you have any recommendations in the teachings you are doing nowadays to realize how to focus and just not think like I'm this, to going into the duality?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, actually. Um, I would I would restructure your the direction of your question by saying focus. You can only focus on something, and that something, by its nature, must be something with form. Anything that has form is, by its nature, separate, and it must belong to perspective or duality. So here's the kicker that if you defocus, because what are you focusing if not attention, right? So attention, its source, and I'm speaking practically here, what you call attention is a focusing of what? Of you. So what is you? What do you mean by you? To know what you are, you must defocus. Defocus attention. And the mind will ask, where do I defocus my attention? That makes no sense because you don't defocus to a particular point, right? Another way to say it is relax attention, and what remains, that's you. And so that is the way in which you can, this is not a departure from experience. It's actually a capacity to be so alert in experience that you can see everything. So you can see both polarities at the same time. And this is the balancing exercise. Yes. So I would say that it's a defocusing of the only thing that is focused is attention. Attention defocus, it's like a floodlight. It's not pointing to any particular thing, and it's illuminating everything. And you are that illumination. In fact, that's why we use the metaphor of enlightenment. And it's just being who you are. So remember what you are in the moment. When you feel contracted, when you feel uh, whatever it is that you feel, you're identifying with some polarity. I'm not saying identifying with polarity is wrong. It's a privilege that we have if you want to, play the game of life. And we do play the game of life because we're all interacting here, uh, behaving, and um, we're playing the game of separate beings. And it's fun,
Mm.
but don't believe it. Not in your mind.
So
Does that
curious.
make sense?
Well, you were saying this uh, to focus. You were closing your eyes. It's something like for you at this moment works to really keep you in the present, just like center your attention. Is something you realize with the time, or with I don't know if nowadays in your practice you just like catch it super fast and you don't have to really, oh my God, no impressions. I'm closing my eyes. I'm just speaking. I'm the voice, but this voice is the non-duality.
You know, I think closing my eyes is just a habit of something that um, so our what we call our body is made out of senses, and the brain, we can see how the brain consumes energy based on our senses, and vision is probably uh, almost half of the energy that is used in sense perceptions is the eyes. So that's why we tend to close our eyes to um, eliminate or avoid distraction or stimulus to the brain, and that helps us to defocus. That's why we tend to close our eyes. But no, like I said, this is a habit, right? It's a habit of it feels good, it
Mm.
feels nice, but it's not necessary. In fact, my teaching goes always to say that this is just the inner path. It's only the first, it's only the beginning. The rest is coming out of that and permeating that understanding here because it's not inside. It's it's everywhere. It's this. So bringing this understanding outwards is is something that yeah just makes life beautiful and not dependent on meditation or whatever other contemplative practice we have.
Mm. You mentioned today also that that's today that Carla actually get into a difficult position because the consumption of the LSD, and since there for her was very difficult to hold the contact. Um, what do you think about exactly, or what do you think about uh, opening this door to to the awareness somehow with this kind of methodologies, if we can call it like that.
I think it's a very appropriate question. I, as many, have done psychedelics, and I know what they cause in the mind, experientially. And that's why it's a sort of, Pandora's box that we open here, because, like I said, it's all a matter of identity and how strong is our identity with the limited being that when we expose the conscious mind, which again, it's a very limited perspective of reality, when we expose the conscious mind to something that is full of information, then what will happen? We don't know. So it's a very complex thing, and I I particularly don't feel that is a it's neither helpful nor detrimental. It really depends on the such complex way of the mind to absorb this. But we must know, we must have an educated approach to these substances to know that they are opening, because see what's practically happening. Um, we get impaired. All substances create some sort of impairment or enhancement or something. And the impairment here is the capacity for us to be able to use effectively self-referential thoughts to refer to ourselves as a an individual being. So that being impaired, awareness goes randomly, we could say. It goes wild, or it can go wild. Because of this impairment, then what happens? What changes in self-identity is so random, right? Because in the end, all we report is something that happened to the self. And that's why we have mixed experiences. There's always a sort of mixed reaction to this experience because, yeah, there's so much that that can happen in this interaction. So I would obviously suggest to everybody that the gentle approach is the most sustainable, the more reliable, and that gentle approach is the not the impairment in a very sudden and um, strong way like psychedelics do, um, of the self-referential thought which creates the ego, but rather the soothing, gentle approach of meditation to the dissolution of this which is unnecessary. That would allow for a greater integration of that which is within us and wants to come out, as opposed to a very random and um, who knows how that's going to happen. But yeah, it's one of those topics that it's so debatable about, its efficiency, its practicality, and so on.
Mm. Yeah, and indeed, we were last Sunday, I think. We were talking also even in the group, in the Zoom calls we also have about this. And you can approach again this kind of awareness or this kind of a state even with your breath, like there is the breath work which brings you also to that level. So we have already everything inside ourselves, and what most beautiful tool that being an observer of all the sensations, emotions, and actually actions you are doing so day by day. That's more than enough. Just this observe. Don't judge yourself. Don't do this. It's not really not to do it. It's just to be present, to be in the present moment. I'm seeing that there is a hand up from one of our participants. Do you want to set a question, Joe? No, Harris?
Yes, thank you for that, Gabriel. Um, if I heard you correctly, you said it's better not to identify as a particular polarity. Would you carry that over into any identification? So identifying as whatever, a mother, a woman.
Beautiful question, actually. I love this. So there's only one identity. That's the only one that matters and is who you are. That can be established always and should be established always, who you are. And that means that, yes, you are not anything in particular, a mother, and so on. Hold on, don't bring your torches and pitchforks yet. Um, there is an activity that we call motherhood. There's an activity that we call friend. There's an activity that we call woman, men, all of these. Um, so this is what is happening rather than what you are. And when you're established in your true being, then there is no disharmony in acting appropriately depending on what it is that life is putting at you. So you're adapting to the experience as it is needed. So you're a mother at that moment because that's what you're doing. But you're always yourself. And you can always be yourself in any single activity that you do. The whole thing is about keeping a mental identity away from us, right? Because you don't need to remind yourself that you are a mother to be a mother. It comes instinctively, it comes naturally. You don't have to remind yourself that you're a woman. And certainly, when we see an exacerbated behavior of pride for whatever reason, whatever label we have, it's just because that mental label has been intensified, right? And so we need the constant reminder of saying, I am a man, and this is what men do, and I am a man. Uh, you know, if I am a man, I don't need to reinforce it. I mean, that is what it is, and I don't need to justify it or try to, show it to people's. And, it's really just always be who you are and let the activity that you have to do be the activity. Everything that you'll do will be harmonious.
Yeah, no, I agree with this, and I actually think reflected in nowadays, um, when people put an identity or a label on something, especially children's behavior, then the entity takes on that persona. Does that make sense? So you're kind of limiting uh, what something or someone is. Does that make sense? So for instance, my granddaughter has been labelled with, hang on, now let me get this right. It is neural something. I've forgotten the exact what it was. Um, And I almost feel that because she's got that label, it's kind of limiting her. It's she knows that, so it's not letting her go beyond that. Does that make sense?
I think
So
so.
I think that I don't know if you heard this, but I heard this. It was a channeling. Can't tell you who it was. But the entity that was speaking through didn't have a name, or said it didn't have a name, and it said that once the questioner gave it a name, it was then a limited amount of information. Have you heard that?
Well, I mean, here's a practical example. If I stop in your sentence, you gave me, let's put it this way, you gave me a paragraph with a question, and at some point I stop your paragraph, right, in one of your sentences and say, hold on, who said that, right? I mean, it's information. What you're seeing is information. There's nobody there, right? So did you have different entities construct the sentences? Or was there just a free flow of information
Mm,
that either makes sense or doesn't?
mm,
Either, and it not just makes sense, either resonates and says yes, your heart says yes or no. So I think it's a little bit more helpful to see everything as just information or movement. I know it sounds very basic, but we're trying to come out of complexity here. You won't arrive to simplicity in life through complexity. That's an oxymoron, or it seems kind of strange. So, yes, we live in a world that is filled with labels, filled with labels, and especially when it comes to describing somebody's behavior, we've slapped the word pathology to it. And that's what really makes things uncomfortable because there seems to be a normal that nobody has. It seems like an ideal in our minds. Nobody's normal. Everybody that goes to a psychologist or some so-called professional, and this is nothing against, professionals, they're only doing what they have learned to do. They need to slap some sort of label on a pathology. I have to actually have students who are psychologists, and they are very much disturbed with the work that they do. The more they go into this, because they say people are just having natural experiences, normal experiences. And, we are supposed to label them and give them medicine to try to dumb them down. So, no, I'm a very Taoist in this sense that we should not restrain anybody nor label anything, and we would
mm,
be free. The more we try to control and label and, box people, it just creates a sense of disquietness in all of us. Like, oh, he's a weird person because he's not acting like we're supposed to. And some of us, we just have a lot more control than others. So I see most people just free.
mm,
And us who can control our minds are just miserable. So I see these people a lot more free and we're just, slapping labels on them. Um, so yeah, that makes sense. And it beautifully connects with what you're saying of this contact. Stop giving names. Stop giving, it's just not even names to entities, but name to things. In Zen, you say, what is this? People would say all kind of names and things. Oh, that's by the way, this was a gift from Gary, appropriate. It's for presentations, you just kind of flip around, right? So in Zen, we say, no, this is this, right? This is the reality of it. It makes this or this and scratch your back with it. That's
yeah.
true.
Mm. Thank you.
Um, a tiny extension to that question. Um, Here, someone is asking, like, if, for example, a gay to be a gay pride is a distortion as well?
Well, pride in any sense is is based on an identity or on something that we feel we have done. So it's predicated on a separate self, always, right? Proud of being a parent, proud of being, and I think what we mean is love. We love ourselves, right? That's what we mean. Uh, but maybe it's not necessary, to say I love myself. Maybe it's just necessary to love yourself and radiate it. So again, because pride is something that you did, at least pride should be that, right? You should be proud of what you do. That's, I'm not saying that you should, it's just the general sense of it. So who is it that did it? I don't think I do anything. I think the universe is what does everything. And I'm just an expression of that. And I mean that. Everything that I say here, my all my understandings come from standing in the shoulders of giants. So am I really doing it? Or is it everybody in the past that has made this experience possible? And so with each one of you. So you're not doing it. That would be very arrogant to say, I am doing it. And there are degrees of arrogance that the separate self can incur. Am I saying, should I be miserable? No, I'm not saying any of that. That also would be predicated on the separate self. So I think a deeper understanding would brings us more into humility, true humbleness, which is to say, I don't know, I just do, and what I do is precisely what it's meant to do. And, there's no pride in there. And it feels better. Whenever we're proud of something, we become kind of defensive. We can become rigid, which again, don't confuse with love. It's different. Loving what you do, loving what you are, loving your community, all of these things. Um, we need to see the discernment between that and what pride usually refers to, which is just um, like an accomplishment that is I owe or I own, actually.
Okay, thank you so much for the answer. Um, I think that's from today at least. Um, I don't know if someone else wanted to ask any tiny bit of question, or if we maybe we can close with some words, Gabriel, that you wanted to say before we leave the session 25 and 24 for today.
Yeah. I want to read what Daniel's also shared, which is one teacher told me once pride. One teacher, I can't read anymore. One teacher told me once, pride is cause of many wars. And that's true. Defensive. And we get a little uneasy, when somebody, you see, if you are offended by anything, watch out. There's something rigid in you. You should never be offended by anything. And that's awesome. So you should welcome every offense. That's why Jesus said, oh, here, slap me on the other side, please. You see? If you are defensive, if there is something in you that stirs when somebody says something, man, be grateful for that because you're being shown something that doesn't belong to you. And that exacerbated is what brings, uh, especially men pride in the past used to be a big thing. That's what brought all the wars. And, ironically, also the desire to do good. right? Let's do good to these people who are so ignorant. Let's bring them, you know, whatever it is that we consider to be better. So battles, wars, appropriate. Look at your inner self. Look at your mind. Just watch it all play. That's the real dynamic of opposites. And I think what I got most out of this last session was this beautiful description of how, if you can visualize it with me, your mind is always bringing up. First of all, place yourself as the awareness of experience. Awareness has no opposite. There is nothing opposite to awareness. And awareness is what you call I. When you say I, it's the same thing as awareness. So look at yourself as awareness. Don't put a label on yourself because a label is what you are aware of, not what you are. And from there, you can see anything that's coming up, anything, and watch it. Watch it as it balances out. It must have an opposite. And there's a beautiful dance between all of them. The thing is always to look in experiential activity and also within your mind that there's always a choosing. Which one do you choose that is your choice? I'm not going to say better. I'm not going to give you guidelines because the guidelines is your heart. Your heart is what tells you this is what's right now. And you do that at every given moment. There's a point in which the teaching must bring you to full trust and confidence on whatever it is that your heart wants to do. And that goes beyond morality or anything. That's a higher teaching in you. And it's all about observing that dynamic of thoughts. It's not a battle, it's not a conflict. You're not in conflict. You're just having a dynamic, and there is too much resistance. If it feels like there's conflict in your mind, it's because there is resistance. That's it. Place yourself as you are, be yourself, and things just unfold naturally.
Okay.